I watched the water level drop 6 inches in 2 hours, which should have been impossible for a reservoir that held nearly 40 million gallons. Standing on the earthen dam I'd personally engineered and permitted, I pulled out my phone to call the county sheriff because what I was witnessing wasn't a leak or natural seepage. Someone had deliberately opened the emergency spillway gates without my authorization. My name is Andrew Garrison, and I'm a civil engineer who made the mistake of buying a 100-acre property in Pine Valley Estates, Colorado, about 30 miles west of Colorado Springs. When I purchased the land 3 years ago, it came with water rights dating back to 1887 and a natural basin perfect for creating a private reservoir. I spent 2 years and nearly $300,000 getting every permit, every environmental study, every engineering assessment approved by the state. The reservoir wasn't just a vanity project. My property sat at the head of a small watershed, and I designed the system to provide controlled water release for the ecosystem downstream while giving me irrigation capacity for the organic farm I was developing. The HOA formed 6 months after I moved in. That should have been my first warning sign. Pine Valley Estates had existed for decades as a loose collection of large rural properties, most ranging from 20 to 200 acres. People moved here specifically to avoid the suburban nightmare of matching mailboxes and paint color restrictions. But when a Denver development company bought 3 parcels and started subdividing them into 5-acre luxury rural estates, everything changed. The new residents wanted structure, rules, order. They wanted an HOA. I voted against it. So did most of the original landowners. But Colorado law only required a majority of property owners, not a majority of acreage, and the new subdivision lots outnumbered us. The Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association became official in February 2025, and by March, they'd hired Patricia Cunningham as their association manager. Patricia was exactly what you'd picture when someone says HOA Karen. 52 years old, blonde highlights that hadn't been refreshed in 3 months, and a perpetual expression suggesting she'd just discovered dog waste on her tennis shoe. She drove a white Lexus SUV with a custom license plate that read RULS4ALL and wore athleisure outfits that probably cost more than my monthly truck payment. Her first act as association manager was sending violation notices to 7 properties, including mine. According to Patricia, my reservoir constituted an unapproved water feature that required HOA Architectural Review Committee approval. I'd laughed when I opened that letter. Actually laughed out loud standing at my mailbox. My reservoir predated the HOA by 2 years. I had state permits, county permits, Army Corps of Engineers approval. The thing was a legitimate piece of water infrastructure, not some backyard koi pond. I drafted a polite response explaining that the reservoir existed before the HOA and fell outside their jurisdiction. I included copies of my state water rights documentation and the county's signed engineering approvals. I thought that would be the end of it. Patricia responded with a 6-page letter citing various community standards and insisting that all water features, regardless of when constructed, required retroactive approval. She demanded I submit detailed plans, pay a $500 review fee, and attend an architectural review committee hearing. That's when I hired a lawyer. Tom Braddock was a property rights attorney based in Colorado Springs who'd made a career out of fighting HOA overreach. He sent Patricia a letter explaining in very clear legal terms that my reservoir was grandfathered infrastructure covered by state water law, which superseded any HOA authority. For 2 months, things went quiet. I thought we'd won. Then, the violations started escalating. Patricia cited me for having a commercial vehicle on my property because my F350 dually had a utility bed. She claimed my split rail fencing violated the approved fencing materials list, despite that style being common throughout the area for 50 years. She even tried to fine me for excessive dust when I was having gravel delivered for my driveway. Tom batted down each violation with carefully worded legal responses. Every letter cost me money, but I was making a point. I wasn't going to let some power-hungry HOA manager dictate what I could do with my legally permitted property. The The reservoir incident happened on a Tuesday in late May 2026. I'd been in Denver for a consulting job and drove back late afternoon. The moment I turned onto my property, something felt wrong. The cottonwood trees near the reservoir looked different, their exposed roots visible where they should have been underwater. I parked and ran to the dam. The water level was catastrophically low, maybe 20 feet below the spillway where it should have been just kissing the overflow gates. The emergency drain system, which I'd installed per Army Corps specifications and kept locked with a commercial-grade padlock, was wide open. Water was pouring through the 30-inch drain pipe at roughly 5,000 gallons per minute. The lock had been cut. Bolt cutters, from the look of the sheared metal still hanging from the hasp. I immediately closed the valve, but the damage was done. Millions of gallons had already drained into Clear Creek, which ran through the valley below my property. I called 911 first, then Tom, then the county water commissioner. Sheriff Deputy Mike Hernandez arrived within 20 minutes. He was a good guy, mid-30s, who'd grown up in the area and understood rural property issues. He photographed the cut lock, took my statement, and called for a detective. "This is criminal mischief at minimum," he said, examining the valve mechanism. "Given the water volume involved, probably reckless endangerment too. Anyone downstream who could have been affected?" That's when my stomach dropped. Clear Creek ran through the Riverside Farm property about 2 miles downstream. The Martinez family had been running that operation for 3 generations, growing hay and running about 50 head of cattle. The creek supplied their irrigation pond and livestock water. I pulled out my phone and dialed Roberto Martinez. He answered on the first ring. "Andrew, what the hell happened?" His voice was tight with controlled anger. "My pond overflowed 2 hours ago, took out my pump house and flooded my lower hayfield. I've got 15 acres underwater. Roberto, I'm so sorry. Someone sabotaged my reservoir, opened the emergency drain without authorization." "Someone? Who?" "I don't know yet, but I'm standing here with a sheriff's deputy. This is a crime scene." Detective Sarah Chen arrived around sunset. She was thorough, photographing everything from multiple angles, collecting the cut lock as evidence, and taking detailed measurements of the valve system. She was particularly interested in the fact that the mechanism required specific knowledge to operate. "This isn't something a random vandal could figure out," she said, examining the valve assembly. "Someone either knew what they were doing or had instructions." "It's not complicated if you understand basic water systems," I said. "But yeah, it's not intuitive to someone without that background." "Who has access to your property?" "Legally, just me and my lawyer has a key to the front gate. But this is rural land. Someone determined could access it from multiple directions." She made notes. "Who benefits from draining your reservoir?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound paranoid. "The HOA has been trying to assert authority over it for months. They want me to tear it down or put it under their jurisdiction." "That's a big leap from harassment to infrastructure sabotage." "I'm not accusing anyone. I'm just answering your question about who might want it gone." Detective Chen spent another hour documenting the scene before leaving with evidence bags. She promised to follow up but warned that without witnesses or video evidence, the investigation would be challenging. I spent the rest of the evening assessing the damage. The reservoir would refill naturally from the springs that fed it, but that would take weeks. My irrigation system was useless until then. Worse, I had no idea what the sudden water surge had done to the downstream ecosystem or properties. I called Roberto back and promised to cover his damages. He was frustrated but reasonable about it. "Just find out who did this, Andrew, and make sure it doesn't happen again." The next morning, I drove down to Riverside Farm to see the damage firsthand. It was worse than Roberto had described. The irrigation pond had overtopped its banks, washing out the pump house and destroying the electrical system. The lower hayfield, which should have been getting ready for first cutting, was a muddy lake. Debris hung in the fence lines, showing a high water mark at least 4 feet above normal. "Insurance adjuster is coming this afternoon," Roberto said, walking me along the damage path. "But my deductible is $10,000 and I'll lose the entire first cutting on this field. That's another $15,000 in lost revenue." "I'll cover all of it," I said. "This happened because of my infrastructure, even though I didn't cause it." "I know you didn't." He picked up a piece of broken lumber that used to be part of his pump house. "You're always careful with that reservoir. This was deliberate." We walked back to his farmhouse, and his wife Maria offered coffee. Their daughter Sophia, who was home from Colorado State studying agricultural business, sat at the kitchen table with a laptop open. "I've been documenting everything for the insurance claim," she said, turning the screen to show photographs. "But Dad, you should see this." She pulled up a social media page for the Pine Valley Estates HOA. The most recent post, from yesterday afternoon, caught my attention immediately. Patricia Cunningham had written, "Good news for Pine Valley residents. The unauthorized water retention structure that posed a safety risk to our community is being addressed. Remember, community standards protect everyone's property values." The post was timestamped at 3:47 p.m. the previous day, right around when my reservoir was draining. "That's not proof," I said, though my hands were shaking with anger. "But it's suspicious as hell." I took screenshots and forwarded them to Detective Chen and Tom. Tom called me within 5 minutes. "Don't engage with her," he warned. "Don't post anything. Don't respond. Don't even go near her. Let law enforcement handle it." She basically admitted to it on social media. She implied knowledge of the situation. That's different from admission. "Andrew, I'm serious. If she did this, she'll get caught. But if you confront her and things escalate, you could jeopardize the case." I forced myself to take his advice, but it was the hardest thing I'd done in months. I wanted to drive straight to Patricia's house and demand answers. Instead, I went back to my property and started documenting my own damages for insurance. The reservoir wasn't just water storage. I'd installed solar-powered aeration systems to maintain oxygen levels for the aquatic ecosystem. I'd planted native vegetation around the shoreline to prevent erosion and provide wildlife habitat. I'd created a functional wetland area that attracted migratory birds. All of that was compromised with the water level so drastically reduced. My phone rang around noon. Unknown number, local area code. "Mr. Garrison? This is Amanda Foster from Channel 9 News in Colorado Springs. We received a tip about a major water incident involving an HOA dispute. Would you be willing to comment?" I almost hung up. Then I reconsidered. "Who gave you the tip?" "I can't reveal sources, but we've been told there's an ongoing conflict between you and the Pine Valley Estates HOA regarding a private reservoir. The HOA has been harassing me for months about legally permitted water infrastructure. Yesterday, someone criminally sabotaged that infrastructure, releasing millions of gallons of water and causing significant downstream property damage. The sheriff's office is investigating. Would you be willing to do an on-camera interview?" I thought about Tom's warning not to engage. But this was different. "Let me call my attorney and get back to you." Tom surprised me by approving the interview. "Public pressure might actually help here. Just stick to facts. Don't accuse anyone by name. Let the evidence speak for itself." The news crew arrived at my property that afternoon. Amanda Foster was professional and well-prepared, asking specific questions about the reservoir's purpose, the permitting process, and the timeline of HOA harassment. I showed them the cut lock, the valve mechanism, and the depleted reservoir. We drove down to Riverside Farm, and Roberto agreed to be interviewed about the damage to his property. The story aired that evening at 6 o'clock. It was surprisingly well done, focusing on the property rights angle and the potential criminal charges. They'd even gotten a statement from Detective Chen confirming an active investigation into criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. What made it perfect was the final segment. Amanda had confronted Patricia outside her home, asking for comment. Patricia's response was gold. "That reservoir has always been a safety concern for this community," Patricia said, standing in her driveway with her arms crossed. "Someone finally took action to protect property values and resident safety." "Are you saying you know who drained the reservoir?" Amanda asked. Patricia's eyes widened as she realized her mistake. "I'm not saying anything specific. I'm just glad the situation is being resolved. The property owner says the reservoir was legally permitted by multiple state and federal agencies. How is that a safety concern? Permits can be challenged. Our HOA has every right to protect this community." The interview ended with Patricia going back inside her house, but the damage was done. She'd essentially admitted knowledge of the drainage and implied it was justified. My phone exploded with calls and messages. Other property owners in Pine Valley Estates reached out. many expressing frustration with Patricia's management style. Several said they'd received ridiculous violations similar to mine. A few admitted they'd voted for the HOA, but now regretted it. Detective Chen called the next morning. "Can you come to the sheriff's office this afternoon? I have some updates." I arrived at 2 o'clock. She led me to a conference room where she had printouts of social media posts, photographs, and what looked like phone records spread across the table. "We executed a search warrant for Patricia Cunningham's phone and computer this morning," she said. "Based on the social media post and her statement to the news, we had probable cause to investigate her involvement." "What did you find?" "Text messages to a contractor named Jake Sullivan. She hired him to assess your reservoir 2 weeks ago. The messages are coded, but the implication is clear. She asked if the drainage system could be deactivated without causing immediate flooding." My jaw clenched. She planned this. It gets worse. Sullivan has a criminal record, 2 priors for criminal mischief and 1 for trespassing. He specializes in what he calls property compliance services, which appears to be a euphemism for forcing people to comply with regulations through extra-legal means. "Has he been arrested?" "We're looking for him now. He's not at his registered address, but we have enough to charge Patricia Cunningham with conspiracy to commit criminal mischief, reckless endangerment, and criminal tampering with water infrastructure. That last one is a felony in Colorado when it affects agricultural or municipal water supplies. When will you arrest her?" "Warrant is being issued now. We'll pick her up this evening." I drove home feeling vindicated but also exhausted. This whole situation had spiraled so far beyond anything I'd imagined when I bought this property. All I'd wanted was peace, privacy, and the space to build something meaningful. Instead, I'd ended up in a criminal investigation because someone couldn't stand that I wouldn't bow to their authority. The news of Patricia's arrest broke the next morning. Channel 9 led with it, using footage from their earlier interview and adding mugshot photos of both Patricia and Jake Sullivan, who'd been apprehended trying to leave the state. The HOA connection made it a bigger story than a typical vandalism case. By noon, it had been picked up by Denver stations and even made a brief mention on a national news website's Weird Crime section. The Pine Valley Estates HOA board held an emergency meeting that evening. I wasn't invited, obviously, but 3 board members called me afterward to apologize. They'd had no idea Patricia was planning anything like this. Most of them had assumed she was just sending strongly worded letters, not engaging in actual crimes. "We're terminating her contract immediately," said Gregory Walsh, the board president, "and we're voting to dissolve the Architectural Review Committee. This has gotten completely out of hand." "I appreciate that," I said, "but the HOA itself is still a problem. It was formed specifically to control properties that don't need controlling." "I agree. We're going to put dissolution to a vote at next month's meeting. I think we have the votes now that people have seen how bad this can get." Over the following weeks, the legal process ground forward. Patricia Cunningham was released on $50,000 bail with strict conditions including no contact with me and no involvement with the HOA. Jake Sullivan remained in custody because of his priors and flight risk. My reservoir refilled slowly, fed by the underground springs and seasonal runoff. I had to replace some of the shoreline vegetation that had been exposed and damaged, but the core infrastructure was sound. The insurance covered most of Roberto's damages, and I made up the difference myself. It cost me $43,000 total, but it was the right thing to do. Tom Braddock filed a civil lawsuit against both Patricia and the HOA itself, seeking damages for the reservoir sabotage, legal fees from months of harassment, and punitive damages for the malicious nature of the actions. The HOA's insurance company settled within 2 months for $275,000. Patricia's personal assets were another matter, but Tom was confident we'd collect eventually. The criminal case moved faster than I expected. Colorado takes water crimes seriously, especially in areas prone to drought and where agricultural operations depend on reliable water supplies. The district attorney assigned a senior prosecutor who'd handled environmental crimes before. In August, both Patricia and Jake Sullivan accepted plea deals. Sullivan got 18 months in county jail and 3 years probation for criminal mischief and reckless endangerment. Patricia got 6 months in jail, 5 years probation, and a permanent restraining order preventing her from holding any HOA management position in Colorado. She also had to pay restitution to both me and Roberto Martinez. The Pine Valley Estates HOA voted to dissolve in September. It required a supermajority of property owners, but after everything that happened, people were eager to return to the old informal arrangement. We still have a voluntary neighborhood association that organizes a couple social events per year and maintains the main road, but there's no enforcement power and no mandatory fees. I ran into Patricia one time after her release from jail. It was at a grocery store in Colorado Springs, completely by chance. She saw me from across the produce section and her face went pale. For a moment, I thought she might try to leave, but instead she approached me. "I owe you an apology," she said quietly. "What I did was insane and wrong. I got so caught up in the idea of enforcing rules that I lost all perspective." I didn't know what to say. Part of me was still angry, but she looked genuinely broken, wearing sweatpants and no makeup, none of the polished veneer I'd always seen before. "Why did you target me specifically?" I asked. "Because you wouldn't back down. Everyone else either complied or moved away. You fought every violation, challenged every claim. It made me look weak to the board, like I couldn't do my job." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I know it's not. I just wanted you to understand it wasn't really about the reservoir. It was about control. You destroyed someone's livelihood over a power trip. I know. I'll be paying for it the rest of my life." She gestured vaguely. "Financially and otherwise. I lost my job, my reputation, my marriage. Jeff filed for divorce while I was in jail. I felt a flicker of sympathy despite everything. I hope you figure things out, Patricia, but stay away from HOAs." "That's court-ordered now," she gave a weak smile. "Good luck with your farm." She walked away, and I never saw her again. The farm thrived. My reservoir proved its worth during a dry spell in late summer, providing irrigation water that kept my crops healthy while neighboring properties struggled. I started selling produce at farmers markets in Colorado Springs and Woodland Park, building a small but loyal customer base. Roberto and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. He helped me learn the agricultural side of farming, teaching me techniques his grandfather had used. I helped him upgrade his irrigation system with modern efficiency measures that reduced his water usage by 30%. The legal settlement money went mostly into farm infrastructure. I built a proper barn, expanded my greenhouse operation, and installed a professional irrigation control system for the reservoir. I also established a conservation easement on 50 acres of my property, ensuring it would never be developed regardless of who owned it in the future. Tom Braddock became more than just my lawyer. He was genuinely passionate about property rights and saw my case as a perfect example of why HOAs needed stricter oversight in Colorado. He used the case in presentations to the state legislature, advocating for laws that would limit HOA authority over pre-existing infrastructure and agricultural operations. Some of those proposals actually became law in 2027. The Property Rights Protection Act specifically exempted agricultural water infrastructure from HOA jurisdiction if it predated the association's formation and held valid state permits. It also established penalties for HOA managers who engaged in harassment or exceeded their legal authority. Tom called it the Patricia Cunningham Memorial Act, though that wasn't the official name. I testified before the state legislature in support of the bill, sharing my experience and the financial toll the HOA harassment had taken. Several other property owners testified too, sharing similar stories of HOA overreach. The bill passed with strong bipartisan support because both conservatives and liberals could agree that property rights needed protection from overzealous neighborhood associations. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm after that. I expanded the farm gradually, focusing on quality over quantity. I hired 2 part-time employees, both local kids looking for agricultural experience. I started hosting educational tours of the reservoir system, showing engineering students and water management professionals how private infrastructure could coexist with ecological preservation. The reservoir became something of a local attraction. Birdwatchers came to see the migratory species that stopped there. Families asked permission to fish, which I granted with catch and release rules. The county extension office featured it in a publication about water conservation on private land. I even started dating again. Tessa Green was a wildlife biologist with Colorado parks, and wildlife who came to survey the reservoir ecosystem for a wetland restoration project. She was fascinated by how I had designed the system to support both agricultural and ecological needs. We started talking, then having coffee, then spending weekends hiking around the property, identifying bird species, and documenting wildlife. She moved in about a year after we met, bringing her own expertise to the farm operation. Together we expanded the conservation focus, creating wildlife corridors and improving habitat around the reservoir. She loved the isolation and the work as much as I did. On quiet evenings, sitting on the porch and watching the sun set over the reservoir, I sometimes thought about how differently things could have gone. If Patricia had succeeded in forcing me to abandon the reservoir, or if the criminal charges hadn't stuck, or if the HOA had maintained its power. The whole trajectory of my life had hinged on standing my ground and refusing to let someone else dictate what I could do with my legally permitted property. The downstream damage from that day in May 2026 had been catastrophic in the moment, but it ultimately led to positive changes. Roberto's new irrigation system made his farm more sustainable. The state laws protected other property owners from similar harassment. The Pine Valley Estates community learned that HOAs weren't always the answer to maintaining property values. And I learned that some fights are worth having even when they're expensive and exhausting and seem hopeless. Property rights matter, water rights matter, the freedom to build something meaningful on your own land matters. The reservoir held steady at its designed capacity, releasing measured flows into Clear Creek that supported the downstream ecosystem without causing flooding. The system worked exactly as I had engineered it to work, providing benefits to both my property and the broader watershed. Every time I checked the water levels or adjusted the controlled release valves, I felt satisfaction knowing that this infrastructure would outlast all the petty disputes and power struggles that had tried to destroy it. Jake Sullivan finished his jail sentence and moved to Wyoming, staying far away from Colorado and property disputes. Patricia Cunningham eventually moved to Arizona to live with her sister, working as an administrative assistant at a dental office and keeping a very low profile. The Pine Valley Estates neighborhood continued as an informal community of large rural properties, exactly as it had been before the HOA experiment. My legal bills totaled over $80,000 by the time everything was settled, but the civil settlement more than covered it. Tom actually tried to reduce his fees, but I insisted on paying what he billed. He'd done exceptional work and deserved every penny. Plus, his advocacy work at the state level was benefiting people far beyond just my situation. The farm became profitable in its third year of full operation. Not wealthy making money, but sustainable living money. Between the produce sales, the educational tours, and some consulting work I did for other property owners designing water systems, I earned enough to live comfortably and keep expanding the operation. Tessa and I got married in a small ceremony on the dam in October 2028. Roberto and Maria came, along with Tom and his wife, and about 30 friends and family members. We exchanged vows overlooking the reservoir at sunset, with migratory geese flying overhead and the cottonwoods turning gold around the shoreline. It was perfect. We talked about having kids someday, raising them on the farm with an understanding of where food comes from and how water systems work and why property rights matter. We wanted to build something that would last, something that would outlive us and continue providing benefits to the land and the community. The reservoir became the centerpiece of that vision. It wasn't just water storage or irrigation capacity. It was a statement about what private citizens could accomplish when they invested in infrastructure thoughtfully and followed proper procedures. It was proof that you could balance agricultural productivity with environmental stewardship. It was a living example of why property rights need protection from both government overreach and private association tyranny. Every spring, when the snowmelt came down from the mountains and the reservoir filled to capacity, I felt grateful for the fight I'd fought and won. The water flowing over the spillway in controlled releases was more than just H2O molecules. It was freedom, properly engineered and legally protected. And every time someone new moved into Pine Valley Estates, the longtime residents made sure to tell them the story. Not as a threat, but as a reminder that this community valued independence and respected each other's property rights. A reminder that we'd tried the HOA experiment and it had failed spectacularly. A reminder that some places are better off without rules committees and violation notices and power-hungry managers. The reservoir stood as a monument to all of that. 40 million gallons of clear, cold water held behind an earthen dam I'd built with my own investment and engineering expertise. Water that fed crops and livestock and wildlife. Water that I controlled, not because I was selfish, but because I'd earned that right through proper channels and legal processes. Patricia Cunningham had tried to take that away through vandalism and criminal conspiracy. She'd failed, and the system had held her accountable. That accountability mattered just as much as the water itself. It proved that actions have consequences, even for people who think they're above the law because they carry the authority of a homeowners association. I never regretted buying the property or building the reservoir or fighting the HOA. The costs were high, financially and emotionally, but the outcome validated every dollar spent and every sleepless night worrying about legal strategies. I'd preserved my property rights, improved the local ecosystem, supported downstream agriculture, and helped change state law to protect others from similar harassment. That's worth more than any amount of money or any promise of neighborhood harmony through forced compliance with arbitrary rules. That's the foundation of everything I believed about property ownership and individual liberty, and the proper role of community organizations. The reservoir filled and emptied with the seasons, following natural patterns and human needs. The farm grew and adapted, incorporating new techniques and responding to market demands. The community evolved, finding its own balance between cooperation and independence. And through it all, the water flowed, controlled, measured, purposeful, exactly as it should be, exactly as I'd designed it to be when I first looked at this property and saw potential instead of problems. That's what engineering is really about, not just technical calculations and permit applications, but vision. The vision to see what could exist with proper planning and investment. The vision to balance competing needs and find solutions that work for multiple stakeholders. The vision to build systems that outlast the individual conflicts and serve the greater good. My reservoir embodied that vision, despite everything Patricia Cunningham had done to destroy it. Despite the downstream damage and the criminal charges and the endless legal battles, it survived and thrived. It became better than I'd originally imagined, incorporating conservation features and educational components I hadn't initially planned. Sometimes the best outcomes emerge from overcoming the worst challenges. Sometimes you don't know what you're truly capable of building until someone tries to tear it down, and you have to defend it with everything you have. I defended my reservoir with lawyers and evidence and public pressure and sheer stubborn determination. And when the dust settled and the courts had ruled and the criminals had been sentenced, what remained was stronger and more valuable than what had existed before. That's the real story of the HOA that drained my private reservoir without a court order and caused catastrophic downstream damage. It's not just about property destruction or legal battles or environmental harm. It's about the fundamental question of who controls what on private land and how communities can function without sacrificing individual rights to collective authority. Pine Valley Estates found the answer through trial and error, through conflict and resolution, through crime and punishment. The answer was simple. Respect each other's property rights, cooperate voluntarily instead of through forced compliance, and let people build things that benefit everyone without micromanaging every detail. My reservoir proved that model could work. It existed on my private property, built with my money and expertise, but it provided benefits to the entire watershed. Roberto's farm downstream benefited from reliable water flows. The wildlife benefited from maintained habitat. The community benefited from agricultural production and preserved open space. None of that required an HOA to enforce it. It required one person willing to invest in proper infrastructure and maintain it responsibly. When Patricia tried to destroy it through criminal action, the community came together to support restoration and accountability. Not through association bylaws, but through common decency and shared values. That's the real lesson. Communities don't need forced compliance to function. They need shared respect for each other's rights and recognition that some people will invest in things that benefit everyone without needing rules to compel them. I invested in a reservoir that supported agriculture, ecology, and community well-being. Patricia invested in control and power and her own ego. The criminal justice system sorted out which investment deserved protection and which deserved punishment. The water still flows from my reservoir, feeding Clear Creek and supporting everything downstream. It flows because I built proper infrastructure and defended it when challenged. It flows because the law recognizes water rights and punishes those who violate them. It flows because one person's property rights, properly exercised, can benefit an entire community. And that's worth fighting for, regardless of the cost or the conflict or the catastrophic damage that happens along the way. Some things matter enough to defend with everything you have. My reservoir was one of those things, and I'd make the same choice again without hesitation. The sun sets over the water now, just as it did 3 years ago when I first filled the reservoir. Tessa sits beside me on the porch, watching the geese come in to roost for the night. The farm is quiet except for the gentle sound of water flowing over the spillway, controlled and purposeful. Everything I fought for is right here in front of me. The property, the infrastructure, the freedom to build something meaningful without asking permission from people who have no authority to grant or deny it. The peace that comes from knowing your rights were tested and held firm. Patricia Cunningham tried to take this away. She failed. The reservoir remains and the water flows, and justice was served. That's how it should be. That's how it will continue to be, for as long as I'm here to maintain it and defend it. The reservoir holds 40 million gallons tonight, right at its designed capacity. Every gallon represents a victory over those who think property rights should be subject to committee approval and neighborhood votes. Every gallon proves that individuals can build infrastructure that serves both private and public good. And every gallon reminds me why I'll never live anywhere with a homeowners association again. Some lessons are learned through experience, and this one cost me almost $100,000 in legal fees and property damage. But I learned it thoroughly, and I'll never forget it. The water flows, the farm thrives, the community respects boundaries and property rights. And somewhere in Arizona, Patricia Cunningham lives with the consequences of her actions, hopefully having learned the same lesson I did. You don't mess with someone's legally permitted infrastructure just because you don't like that they won't bow to your authority. That's the end of this story, but it's not the end of the reservoir or the farm or the work of protecting property rights from association overreach. It's just the end of this particular chapter in a much longer story about freedom, responsibility, and what it means to own land in America. The water will keep flowing long after I'm gone. The infrastructure will serve future generations if it's properly maintained. And hopefully, the legal precedents and state laws that emerged from this conflict will protect other property owners from similar harassment. That's legacy worth building. That's a fight worth having. And that's why I stood my ground when the HOA came after my reservoir, and why I'll keep standing it for whatever comes next.